According to Statista.com, it's estimated that over 50 million Americans go camping every year. While most enjoy their time in the wilderness and break from daily life, for some, this isn't the case at all. Let's begin with an incredible, uniquely bizarre disappearance. Charles Rockwood was a former major turned wealthy businessman from Des Moines in Iowa when he disappeared in late September of 1923. Unfortunately, the articles never mention his age, but given his background, experience, his expertise, in addition to the fact that he was married, it's safe to say that he was probably around middle-aged. The first I heard about Charles was from the Burlington Gazette. A message today from Mason Lake, Wisconsin, received here today, indicates that Charles, proprietor of a tyre and battery business here, may have passed away while on a fishing trip at the Wisconsin resort. Mrs. Rockwood reported that Charles's hat and coat had been found on the lake shore. The lake today was being dragged in efforts to find his body. Specifically, Charles travelled with his father-in-law to camp and fish at Mason Lake, an activity that he engaged in frequently. Charles had great survival skills and was frequently outdoors, which made him a very fit man. When the scene was discovered, it was thought that Charles must have fallen into the water and passed away because there was no sign of him or anyone else. However, searching parties in Price County are scouring the woods next to the lake in search of Charles. Although the boat in which Charles went fishing on the day of his disappearance was found floating on the lake, members of the searching party, headed by Sheriff August Johnson, are inclined to believe that Charles hadn't drowned because his hat and coat was on the land some distance from the boat and water. The picture that was being painted was that the hat and coat were too far away from the water to have been washed up, meaning that they had to have been abandoned there for whatever reason. The problem was that they could find no evidence or even an indication of a struggle, animal predation, or any kind of third-party involvement. All the information they had was that on that particular day, Charles had gone down to the lake to set up fishing, and the father-in-law was going to join him not long after. When the father-in-law came down, he found the coat and hat on the shore and the boat floating in the water, and began to search for him, but obviously he couldn't find him, and then made contact with the authorities. Based on the scene, it appeared that Charles obviously had managed to get the boat in the water, but something must have happened right after that. The lake was dragged multiple times and searched over and over again, but they just weren't finding anything. While that was going on, many searchers and volunteers had entered the nearby woods where they too searched, but again, found nothing. When nothing was being uncovered at all, authorities questioned whether this might have been a purposeful act to simply disappear. The problem was that there didn't seem to be any indication that this was the case. Charles was happily married and had a family that he loved. His family and close business acquaintances made it clear that his finances were in a very healthy standing and that his business was performing very well. After that idea was sidelined, this was then stated. Searchers, friends, family, and business associates are mystified by Charles's disappearance. They have heard nothing of the circumstances that might offer a solution to the mystery, except the theory that he may have trailed an animal into the woods and become lost. Rockwood was in good health and was not given to any peculiarities of habit that might lead him to voluntarily drop out of sight, it was stated. The articles didn't mention which, but apparently 3 states became concerned with this disappearance and had each sent personnel down to assist. The rugged wilderness of Price County holds within its grasp a mystery, intriguing the citizenry of 3 states. Charles has disappeared as completely from sight, as though he had been swallowed up by the earth and no one can give a motive for his disappearance. Apparently, an attempt was made to have it appear that Charles had drowned in the lake. That's an interesting statement, and I assume had to have come from authorities. So clearly, a hypothesis surrounding foul play was being considered. The article then went on to say that despite being dragged a number of times, he just wasn't being found in the lake. It also went on to say, no traces in the woods. Other indications lead the sheriff and others to declare that Charles had not drowned. Searching parties have threaded the woods surrounding the lake, but have not come upon any trace of him. To be clear also, Charles was armed and had means of defending himself. This is also where things take a weird turn, so let's get bizarre. This was reported around 20 days after the disappearance. The sensational case, which is now apparently solved, had its beginning last Tuesday night when an unconscious man with a deep injury to his head, apparently caused by a blow, was found in the alley of the Adams Hotel in Phoenix, Arizona. He was dressed in rough clothing and had a small sum of money in his pockets. After being taken to hospital, where he regained intermittent consciousness the following morning, it was believed that Charles had registered at the hotel that morning under the name R.L. Burt. During lucid periods, however, he gave his name as Charles Rockwood of Des Moines. He insisted that he was in Mason Lake, Wisconsin, and insisted that attendants who told him he was in Arizona were wrong. Whatever injury he had sustained, Charles's left arm and leg had been paralysed, but he did regain the use of his leg. Charles had no recollection of what happened the night prior or any of the time that he spent missing. He said that his last memory was pushing the boat out into the water, and then after that it's just dark. He also woke up in that alley with all of his money that he had on his person at the time of disappearance, meaning he hadn't been robbed. I honestly have absolutely no idea where to even go with that. I don't know how you disappear for that length of time and have no recollection of anything. He practically has around 20 days worth of missing time. He also somehow went from Wisconsin to Arizona. Those were the final words on Charles, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's move on to the next disappearance. Garrett Bardsley was 12 years old when he disappeared from the Uinta Mountains in Utah on the 20th of August, 2004. Garrett was a talented Boy Scout who at an even younger age had come to love nature and spending time in the wilderness. Again, despite his young age, he'd received a lot of survivalist teaching and was good in the outdoors. At the time of Garrett's disappearance, he was camping with his father and his Boy Scout group. It was never mentioned if family members of the other boys were attending the trip, but I imagine they were. The Uinta Mountains at this time were chilly and wet, and the weather worsened on the day of his disappearance soon after going missing. The first reports of this disappearance came 4 days into the search effort. Garrett Bardsley of Elk Ridge was last seen Friday morning when his father, Kevin, sent him back to the scout troop's camp after the boy got his shoes, socks and pants wet while fishing, said Sheriff's Captain Joe Offret. Specifically, and to add some more context, Garrett and Kevin were fishing together when Garrett slipped and fell into the water. He wasn't injured, just cold and uncomfortable. The camp the scout group had made wasn't far from the fishing spot, and there were members of the group around the place. This seems to be why Kevin was happy to let Garrett go back to the camp alone, because in the direction Garrett had to walk, there were people there. The distance between the 2 points varied depending on the source, but it's somewhere between 150 to 400 yards away, along an obvious path. Now, something went awry though, because despite the presence of the Boy Scouts and adults, Garrett never made it back to camp. This is a trail that Garrett had walked up and down plenty of times, so it wasn't new to him. This was also something that made Kevin feel like it wasn't a big deal to let Garrett go alone. Around 20 to 25 minutes had passed, and Kevin wondered why it was taking so long, so travel back to the camp himself. This, of course, is when the discovery was made that Garrett never made it back. A search resumed for Garrett, but the weather had dimmed hopes that rescuers will find him in good condition, officials said. The likelihood of finding a responsive individual at this point is extremely low, said the sheriff. Since the day of his disappearance, the area has had freezing overnight temperatures, intermittent hail, and daytime temperatures hovering only in the 40s. The weather got so bad that they were no longer allowing volunteers to assist the search, but only professionally trained mountain rescue teams were allowed up. 5 days after the initial disappearance, this was reported. The search for Garrett was officially labelled a recovery operation, as authorities all but gave up hope and believed they were looking for a body. Dozens of searchers have spent the last 5 days searching for Garrett, who had no food or backpack on him. The search has been hampered by cold, wet weather. Rain mixed with snow fell on searchers Monday, and the temperatures plunged to 18 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 7 degrees Celsius overnight. In essence, the conditions had worsened in the area to such a degree that they no longer thought it was possible that Garrett could have lasted for this length of time. But what was confusing to the searchers was how this happened in the first place. The path leading from the fishing spot to the lake was repeatedly described as a well-established path. Searchers were effectively making the point that they had no clue why or how he strayed from it. The path leads directly to the fishing spot, and Kevin watched his son get back onto the path, so what happened during this time spent alone? Because searchers kept referring to the path as well established, you have to imagine that the path was obvious. So what could have caused him to stray? Perhaps because of the temperatures and having just been in the water with wet clothing. Perhaps he suffered some kind of medical condition that caused him to become confused. There was no evidence of a struggle, foul play, animal predation, or any kind of third-party involvement. Aside from the first option, perhaps it's possible that he spotted a bear or another animal in the woods that spooked him and caused him to stray into the opposite direction of the path. Again, none of this is clear, just purely speculation. But whatever the reason was, Garrett was no longer on the path and hadn't left a single clue behind as to indicate a direction of travel. However, while searching an area full of boulders, they did find one of Garrett's socks half a mile away from the spot in which he went missing. This of course gave searchers an area of focus, but it never revealed anything further. That in and of itself might be of interest actually, because if the area was wet at the time, you might think that at some point searchers would have found a footprint or something to that effect. Some sign, but as far as I can tell, that never happened. Hundreds of people would end up searching this area and would never find anything further. Searchers didn't really understand what had gone so terribly wrong here, other than coming to the conclusion that at some point Garrett must have succumbed to hypothermia. The conditions and events leading up to that point were not understood at all, and given the constant wording of the well-established path, you can only really conclude that was what was causing so much confusion, in the sense that they weren't sure why he strayed from it. That's also the end of the paper trail, so what happened to Garrett Bardsley? There wasn't a whole lot of reporting on this incident, but I did find information about a 3-year-old boy, Kenneth Gherkin, who disappeared 6 days after Garrett while camping with his mother at the Crease Pond campground in Montana. It seems that the pair, along with Kenneth's even younger brother, were there while waiting for their new home to be sorted out. On the 26th of August 2004, Kenneth and his mother had finished their short walk not too far from the campground and returned around lunchtime. Kenneth's mother began to cook dinner while he played nearby. However, some time after being wrapped up with cooking, she turned around to find that Kenneth wasn't in sight anymore. She called out her son's name and darted into the nearby tree line, but there was no sign of him and no response. Others realised what had happened and began to help searching, but within such a short period of time, somehow Kenneth had gotten far away enough that he couldn't hear the calls from the people at the campground. This incident turned into a full-scale, professional search and rescue operation quickly, and the authorities took charge of the situation as police arrived shortly thereafter, with experienced searchers arriving afterwards, along with volunteers as the word spread. The first report I could find came 3 days after the initial disappearance. A pond became the focus of efforts to find Kenneth after a group search turned up no sign of him. Divers planned to search Crace Pond in the 9 Mile Valley. "We have covered 100% of our ground search area. We're going to cover that pond up there with divers," said Sergeant Dave Ball of the Sheriff's Department. So, it seems that by this time, the searchers had covered all the ground they thought possible for Kenneth to reach alone, and now instead placed a heavier focus on the pond where the pair had been walking earlier, presumably thinking that perhaps he went back and had fallen in. It wasn't just people on the ground either. They had search dogs who hadn't found a scent at any point, and they had helicopters in the air with thermal imaging technology who also hadn't spotted anything. Kenneth wandered away and left no trace behind at all, and it seems that this fact may have led the authorities to suspect alternatives. Authorities had said that they wanted to find the child's biological father. Dave Ball said the possibility that the father came to Montana and took the boy out of state had to be considered. This turned out not to be true, but given the circumstances, it's not so surprising that the authorities began to suspect that a third party may have been involved here. Thankfully though, Kenneth was found a day later, though this wasn't without its peculiarities as expressed by the searchers. Late Saturday, a day-long search of the pond found no trace of the youngster. The organised search was called off temporarily, awaiting arrival of a dog specially trained in water searches. But officials said that 2 area residents decided to conduct their own search, and one of them found the boy sitting along a trail eating a leaf. This discovery was described as a miracle by the sheriff and searchers alike. Lightly clothed and without food, Kenneth survived 3 nights with temperatures dropping into the low 40s, or 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. If you believe in miracles folks, Missoula got one today. Missoula County Sheriff Mike McKeekin said Sunday night, "You never give up, but I was really orienting to expect the recovery of a body." Searchers were in disbelief and said that Kenneth was found just over half a mile outside the search zone, which seemed to surprise everyone. They never said how big the search zone actually was though. Presumably, because of Kenneth's age, the expectation was that he would be found rather close to the campground, but somehow had made it outside of the entire search area. It seems that there was also confusion about how Kenneth managed to stay warm for this time, as the temperatures in the area had dropped and gotten quite cold over the time he spent missing. Earlier, the authorities were questioning whether a third party might have been involved, and perhaps this is one of the reasons people began to question if some kind of third party might have been looking after him and keeping him warm. It seems that this angle also explained why the dogs weren't able to find a scent, and why he was found outside the search area. Though it's difficult to describe a motive if that were the case. And to be clear, there was no evidence at all to suggest that he'd been taken by someone else. Only that there were suspicions and people talking about this. That line of thought seems to have been given short shrift though, as everyone was just elated that he had been found and returned safely. The disappearance of Matthew Green provides a cautionary tale for everyone that loves to spend time in the wilderness. This is a man that disappeared from the face of the earth and failed to leave behind a single trace or clue as to what happened to him. Matthew was 39 years old and was considered to be very intelligent. He was a high school maths teacher at the time, but he was also a very experienced climber and he did this a lot in his free time. In mid-July of 2013, Matthew was dropping his car off at an auto shop for repairs in the Mammoth Lakes area. This is a small ski town in California's Eastern Sierra, bordering Yosemite National Park. This is a trip that had been successful and enjoyable up until now. He and a number of friends of his had been climbing in the area But around the time they were planning to leave and head back to Colorado for more climbing, his car blew a head gasket. His friends still left as planned, and he agreed to meet them at a Colorado mountain range. Only Matthew would never meet with his friends again. As the work on his car progressed, he sent a text to his friend which read, "I may have to spend the rest of my life here in Mammoth." The final time Matthew was heard from was when he spoke to his parents on the phone on the 16th of July 2013. The following day, he was supposed to pick his car up, but he never showed up at the garage. What was found thereafter was that his campsite was left untouched, meaning that there didn't appear to have been any kind of struggle with a third party or animal. The authorities then contacted his bank and phone provider. It was realised that his credit cards hadn't been used, nor had he made contact with anyone else. There was one clue left behind at the campsite though, a couple of pages torn out from a mountaineering book which perhaps hinted at the Minarets and Ritter Range. This is a rugged mountain area in the Ansel Adams Wilderness. Even today, we're not sure if Matthew actually made it to the Minarets, and his body has never been found. He never told anyone where he was going or what he was doing, so the assumption was that he was going to relax around the campsite and wait for the car, but this clearly wasn't the case. The problem this caused was actually quite major because the authorities had no earthly idea where they were even supposed to begin the search. As a result of this, the official search couldn't even begin, so instead they sent search teams on training efforts to the Minarets and Ritter Range. As well as doing their own training, the other objective was to find any kind of sign that Matthew had been there. They checked the logs but didn't find Matthew's name printed, nor did they find any physical signs either. In 2016, more than 600,000 Americans were reported missing, according to the FBI's National Crime Information Center. At the end of the year, nearly 85,000 of those cases were still active. Matthew Green is the only unsolved missing person case in Mammoth Lakes. Most people assume that Matt was a victim of some sort of climbing accident, a fall of some sort, says John Greco, Matthew's good friend and climbing partner that met him in California. But all his friends agree that he was experienced, skilled and careful in the mountains. Perhaps it didn't even cross Matthew's mind to tell anyone where he was going, and this is something we should all think about from time to time. We all have a normalcy bias, and because he was so experienced at climbing and had done so many times, the thought process for him was probably automatic and subconscious. It was probably something along the lines of, "It's normally okay, therefore it will be okay this time." Had Matthew have told anyone where he was going and what his plans were, this may have been a very different story. Matthew's loved ones and friends all spoke of how fit he was and how his love for the outdoors translated into an exceptional skill set over the years. When he was young, he became a Boy Scout and spent much time with his dad in the wilderness. This would eventually lead to Matthew spending a great deal of time in mountainous areas with his friends, camping and climbing. He was very highly regarded by everyone who knew him. More than 2 weeks after Matthew talked to his parents for the last time, Detective Hornbeck contacted Verizon for an emergency information request. Verizon concluded that Matthew's phone had been powered off for quite some time and there was no way to track the current location. The last ping Verizon registered was on July the 16th from Mammoth Mountain, and it had created a cone shape with towers in Fresno and June Lake. The Mammoth Lakes Police Department did not find any evidence of foul play, and the potential of this being a purposeful act was quickly ruled out. As mentioned previously, because Matthew hadn't told anyone of his plans, the search and rescue teams couldn't even begin the search effort. They said that there were so many trailheads within the cone area given by Verizon that it was an impossible task. This really was a desperate situation, and the entire effort was effectively blind due to a lack of information. Matthew's family hired an aerial tour company to continuously fly over the area, but this provided no help at all. Detective Hornbeck would later say, What frustrates me the most with Matthew is he's so experienced, but he didn't tell anyone where he was going. There's nothing wrong with sending a text and saying, "Hey, I'm going to go climb in the minarets today." That would solve a lot of problems. It will probably never be completely clear what happened to Matthew, and despite 8 years passing now, no sign of him has ever been found. There is, however, an important lesson to be learned, and that is to make sure that at least one trusted person knows of your plans. As far as I can tell, that is pretty much the extent of the paper trail on Matthew's disappearance, so let's move on to the next one. In 2012, 31-year-old Thomas Sebold, who lived in Three Rivers in Wisconsin, had planned a trip to Alaska. He had taken 6 months worth of leave from his workplace and set off in June of that year. Thomas had years upon years of survivalist training under his belt, and he enjoyed being in the backcountry hiking, camping, and generally spending a good amount of time out there. Thomas was originally from Germany and had spent the prior 6 years from 2007 both teaching and training at the Three Rivers Drum Outdoor School. This is a survivalist school specialising in Native American values and techniques ranging from shelter construction to hunting and gathering. Teachers and the founder of the school himself, Tamarack Song, described Thomas as a highly experienced, competent individual and a natural in the wilderness. He described him as a wandering spirit. The Daily Sitka Sentinel, who were covering this incident as it was unfolding, gave more information about Thomas's plans. They stated, Thomas had planned to stay in the northwest Alaska backcountry through October and had booked a flight home to Wisconsin, but he never made it to that flight. Thomas first made the trip to an Alaska native fish camp in southeast Alaska before heading north. Tamarack said Thomas travelled to the northwest Alaska village of Ambler in September, hiking to a cabin about 30 miles to the north up the Ambler River. This area is inside the gates of the Arctic National Park. NationalGeographic.com describes the area as such. Climb practically any ridge in the heart of the park and you'll see a dozen glacial cirques side by side. Serrated mountains that scythe the sky, and storms that snap out of the dark, brooding clouds. 6 national wild and scenic rivers, Alatna, John, Kabuk, Noatak, North Fork Koyuk, and Tineguk. The park lies entirely above the Arctic Circle, straddling the Brooks Range, one of the world's northernmost mountain chains. Thomas had some assistance organising this trip with the help of some members of the school, and they put him in touch with a woman who owned a cabin near the Ambler River. This is where Thomas was heading to meet up with her and her son of 13 years who also lived with her. The Ambler River, and specifically the cabin, is located in Brooks Range, which is located right on the border of the gates of the Arctic National Park. It's important to note that Thomas arrived at the woman's cabin home in June, and 3 months later, on the 27th of September, is the last time he was seen, though not when he went missing. The Daily Sitka Sentinel reported that Thomas, the woman, and the boy canoed down the river to the woman's fish camp sometime in September. Thomas parted ways with the woman and her son on the 27th of September and said that he planned to head back to the cabin. Now, to reach the cabin on foot, from my understanding, means travelling through the gates of the Arctic National Park. Thomas wanted to head back to the cabin because he had planned to hike out 25 miles to Coburg in October and was supposed to contact someone by the 11th of November. The woman and her child, however, had planned to remain at the fish camp and didn't plan to return for some time. When Thomas failed to check in with the person he was supposed to contact, said person reported him missing to the authorities. Thomas was supposed to fly back to Wisconsin on the 15th of November, which of course did not happen. It's worth mentioning that Thomas was not new to this type of land and understood the dangers well. As previously mentioned, he was highly trained and experienced with spending time in extreme areas. For instance, he had spent time camping alone in -32 degrees Celsius or -25 degrees Fahrenheit in harsh northern winter conditions in Norway. The Alaskan authorities deployed aircraft to search from above, but said that no sign of Thomas ever turned up. Authorities did make it clear, however, that they fully expected to find Thomas in good time. While they didn't find Thomas or any sign of him, the pilots did locate the cabin where they landed shortly thereafter. Inside the cabin and around it were no clues to indicate that he was nearby, and it was stated that it didn't look like he'd been there for weeks. While bleak, this did mean that Thomas did in fact make it back to the cabin and was able to complete his journey on the 27th of September. During this time, the weather had taken a turn for the worse and high winds in the region started to hinder the search efforts. According to thomassayboltsearch.blogspot.com, in a search of the cabin, Alaska state troopers found Thomas's diary. The last entry was October the 7th, where he stated that he was preparing to go on a several-day exploration. The troopers found no evidence of him being at the cabin after that approximate date. From that information, we can probably come to the conclusion that it was during this several-day exploration is where he went missing. Unfortunately, the diary entry was not released, so it's unclear if Thomas specifically mentioned where he was going. However, we do know that he had plans to hike to Kobuk, so perhaps that was a possibility. On the 27th of November, the Daily Sitka Sentinel reported this: "Whatever happened to Thomas Saybolt next is a mystery. We believe things may have gone awry for him," said Sergeant Duane Stone, supervisor for the trooper post in Kotzebue. He wrote about his plans to hike out for further exploration, and that is where the letters ended. Other writings found at the cabin contain vague hints of possible plans. A description of hiking and camping at higher elevations and notes on preparing wood at the cabin for upcoming weather. However, despite these clues, searchers could still not figure out where he'd gone. By the time the search concluded, searchers had scanned over 3,500 square mile area of mountains, canyons and river drainages. One pilot stated that he had witnessed a circle marking on gravel around 8 miles north of the Ambler River. Thomas's colleagues said that the circle has such a strong meaning to Thomas that we think there's a high likelihood that he etched the sign. One theory speculated that he knew that he was in trouble and perhaps was denoting a place to drop provisions. Another theory stated that the etching was of a spiritual significance, though it is important to note that a search of the area found no indication of Thomas's presence. Searchers said that they have seen animal tracks but no human tracks anywhere in the area. It's also important to note that the circle, despite its significance to Thomas, may have been completely unrelated to him. Sergeant Stone said that the circle is the only sign of a human traveller in the area, and it was expected that they would find human footprints nearby, or at least a sign of human activity, but that wasn't the case. thomassayboltsearch.blogspot.com posted this on the 14th of December 2012. The National Park authorities have stopped searching for Thomas. Just like the Alaska State Troopers, they also say that they would continue the search if it was their loved one who was missing. It seems at this point, loved ones, family members, friends and colleagues continued their own independent search and hired pilots to fly over the area. To conclude, all search efforts failed and no sign of Thomas has ever been found. Searchers could find no evidence of animal predation or a struggle, no belongings or a campsite were ever found. Search dogs never picked up a scent, and the aerial searches also provided no results other than the etched circle. It's unclear where Thomas went or what took place. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.